and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It just happens to be Little Blue Book number 765, and it is titled Life of Francis of Assisi, written by Henry C. Vedder. Copyright 1925. This is part 4, and we left off at the beginning of chapter 4. And it is titled The Byproducts of Francis. And let's get to the right page. And we need a few more here. There it is. Page 40. Chapter 4, The Byproducts of Francis. Enough accomplishment for one short life, one might think, was the founding of the Franciscan order, the Frateris Minoris. But Francis was the parent of 3 orders, not of one merely, 2 of which at least are still flourishing. About 1194, a girl was born in Assisi, to whom her parents gave the name Clare. She was some 12 years younger than Francis, so there could have been little intimacy between them. She is said to have been a girl of 16 when Francis began preaching to his townsmen, just the age for an ardent and enthusiastic nature to be deeply impressed, and she at once became his disciple. She resolved to devote herself to a life of love and poverty. Though a simple deacon, Francis took upon himself the authority to receive her vows and admit her to his society without any novitate. He doubtless saw in her a kindred spirit, and had no doubt of the genuineness of her vocation or misgivings about her perseverance in the way she had chosen. Neither then nor afterwards was there any scandal or any pretext for scandal in their relations. Clare came to the Porticola on the night between Palm Sunday and Holy Monday, and received from Francis the veil that was the symbol of her new life. Afterwards, going to a house of Benedictine nuns nearby. A week later, a younger sister joined Clare and Francis, received her also into the society. The rage of the father and friends of the 2 girls is said to have been great, and was not altogether unjustifiable. The daughters had acted secretly, asking no parental permission. Moreover, Francis had greatly exceeded his powers and rights, but he was one of its children to whom the Church would forgive much, and in all such cases the rule of the Church was that the call of God to a holy life set aside all obligations to parents. In this case, the Church must not only forgive, but protect, and it did both. Others were awaiting an opportunity to join these sisters, and a retreat for them was found in the chapel of St. Damian, which became to the order of Clarisnists what the Porticola was to Francis. There Clare and her nuns spent their lives, and there in due course she was buried. The growth of the new order was quite as rapid as that of the original society, or first order. It was not long before all the largest towns of Italy had their convents of Poor Clares, as they were often called. For several years the new order had only the oral counsels of Francis to guide them. He kept in constant touch with them, and gave counsel continually. In 1219, Cardinal Ugolino gave them the rule of Benedict, with some amendments, and later Francis drew on a rule similar to that of the Friars Minor, which was some revision by Cardinal Ugolino, was officially confirmed by Pope Innocent IV in 1246. It remains the chief rule of the order to this day. Besides general works of charity, especially visiting and nursing the sick and caring for the poor, the Clarissans have largely given themselves to the education or upbringing of orphan children, accomplishing thereby a social service worthy of all admiration and praise. One cause of this phenomenal growth of the 2 orders during the early years we may undoubtedly find in youthful and uncorrupted enthusiasm for the service of God and the world through voluntary poverty. The secular world The secular clergy of every country in Europe was notoriously ignorant, avaricious, and immoral. The literature of several centuries before the Reformation, proceeding entirely from the Church itself, is more violent in its denunciations of the clergy than any reformer, more candid in describing their unclerical lives than any Protestant. The Grey Friar was at first the sharp antithesis of all this. He possessed nothing but the clothes that he wore. He would accept nothing but food and lodging. He preached the new gospel of love and service with an enthusiasm never surpassed in any age. No wonder he kindled the zeal of thousands for a like life and service. No wonder the Grey Friars were everywhere, or almost everywhere, received with popular joy, and that wealth was heaped upon them against their protest until they gave way and as an order became rich. Though as individuals they continued to profess poverty. But this is to anticipate the tale of their apostasy. The zeal of the new order and the novelty of its principles explain a good deal of its rapid progress, but by no means the whole. There must have been some other cause at work to produce so tremendous an expansion, as almost deserves to be called an instantaneous explosion of social forces. The nature of this cause becomes more evident as we turn to the history of what was known as the Third Order of Francis. The key to the life of Francis is not merely his conviction that he had a direct vision of Jesus and was called by him to the life of poverty. Deeper than that, in his nature, was sympathy with the poor and distressed, and a desire to do something for their relief. As he saw his original society slipping away from his control, being transformed from a group of laymen into another of the monastic orders of the Church, this passionate devotion to the welfare of the poor and suffering humanity about him suggested the new order. It was a last attempt to carry out his original purpose, now threatened with defeat by the manipulations of churchmen. A method occurred to him that could not fail to succeed if he could gain the approval of the Church. That was to admit to an inferior membership in his order all earnest souls who desired to live a higher life of the Spirit, but could not forsake the world. Laymen, men and women alike, even the married, who would take upon themselves very simple obligations. Members of this third order, as it came to be known, were to wear a prescribed garb and conform to a very simple rule, in making which Francis seems again to have had the advice of Cardinal Ugolino. The chief provisions of the rule were: members were to carry no offensive weapons, except in defense of church or country, or with permission of their superiors. They were to abstain from solemn oaths, unless constrained by necessity, and then to keep within limits prescribed by the Holy See. They were to make an annual small contribution to a treasurer, who would disperse it under direction of the ministers or heads of the order. There is room for plenty of doubt whether Francis fully comprehended the possible effect. One page too many. The possible effect of these injunctions. When he put them in his rule, it is even more than possible that Francis had no part in making the rule, but Cardinal Ugolino was one of the shrewdest men of his age, and he understood perfectly. He may have suggested them to Francis so deftly that the saint imagined them to be his own original ideas. Men of his type of simplicity have often been managed in that way by the more astute. That we may comprehend this matter as well as Ugolino did, we must give a little attention to the social state of Italy in the 13th century. Italy in the year 1200 was indeed the forlornest of all European countries. For nearly 1,000 years it had been the theater of incessant warfare. To the ravages of civil wars had succeeded the incursions of the barbarian tribes of north and east. In times without number, armies had devastated its once fertile plains and sacked its rich and populous cities. Out of this confusion had emerged a feudal system, promising and for a time giving protection to life and property, and under the smile of peace, agriculture, industry, and commerce revived and wealth began to accumulate again. The free cities began to lift up their heads, and the way was preparing for the Renaissance. But now, this development was again checked by the later conditions of feudalism, which had become static, hard, and unyielding. Since the incursion of the barbarians, Italy had been no more than a geographical name. It was not a country. It was a cluster of independent principalities and duchies and cities, all at cross purposes and much of the time in actual conflict. Scores of nobles living in impenetrable castles made war upon one another and levied contributions on all whom they could intimidate. Beneath these exactions, the land was groaning. Every able-bodied man owed military service to his lord or his town, and could cultivate fields or attend to business only in the irregular intervals allowed by his predatory service. Most of the work of agriculture had to be carried on by women and children, and the men too old or crippled to fight. The crops were liable at any time to sudden confiscation, either by an invading force or to feed the troops of the overlord. It was indeed hard to say whether the peasant had most to fear from foe or from friend. And in the intervals of peace, how little was the lot of the small cultivator improved. His labor was exacted at his lord's pleasure, to build or repair the castle, to make roads, to erect tool houses, to cultivate the fields or reap the crops of the castle lands. 2/3 of his working days were not seldom taken from him in this manner. He must not kill the birds and the beasts that ravaged his fields. These were the game that the nobility hunted for their hours of pleasure. He must not fell the timber for fuel. That also was his lord's. At most, he might pick up such limbs as they were blown off by the wind, and by collecting sticks in his fashions, he might get wherewith to boil his dinner pot, if he was lucky enough to have anything to cook in it. If, contrary to all reasonable expectations, a man succeeded in harvesting something from his bit of land, he was still not at liberty to enjoy it. The church demanded a tenth, and while a shrewd tenant might sometimes outwit his lord, few could boast of being a match for the witty priest. On various pretexts, the lord took up to half of what remained, and even that was not the end of exactions, as vexations as they were burdensome. Pardon me. The peasant must have his corn ground at his lord's mill, and pay toll. He must have his grapes and olives pressed at his lord's press, and pay toll. Should it by a miracle happen after all this that he had some little surplus to sell, he could not take it to market without purchasing the privilege from his lord, nor get it there without paying various other tolls and taxes. Few had any surplus. If a man got enough by incessant labor to enable himself and family to keep soul and body together, he did well. If not, he and his might starve and welcome. There were plenty to take his place. Such was feudalism. Only not half justice has been done to it. These sentimentalists who sigh for the good old days ought to have the privilege of living for a while under such a system. We have yet to look at the towns. From earliest times, all forms of handicrafts and commerce have naturally gravitated to cities, and men of like occupations have tended to form societies or guilds for mutual benefit and protection. The guilds of the Middle Ages offer an interesting subject for a separate booklet. To do them anything like justice. Here it is enough to say that they were the chief sources of wealth of the medieval town, and also the foundation of civic organization. Most city governments of the period grew out of the union of the guilds, the chief officers of their societies forming a town council, who elected one of their number mayor or burgomeister. In most of the towns, the nobles had been bought into subjection, and feudalism had ceased to press heavy on urban populations. The towns therefore served as a social safety valve. If a peasant found his lot too hard, he could flee to a town, and after a year and a day his lord could not reclaim him. Many of the guilds were largely made up of such ex-peasants, but this was an alleviation of feudalism, not a cure for its evils. What was obviously needed was something that would strike right at the root of the system and hasten its utter downfall. This was accomplished by the Third Order of Francis, especially in Italy. One moment, I need a drink. We can now better understand the zeal of people for the life of poverty that Francis professed and required, and why all his orders, especially the Third, grew like mushrooms in this soil. People did not have to give up much to become as poor as a friar was expected to be, and they escaped from the power of their lords completely. It was emancipation for the poor man and self-sacrifice to become a Franciscan. As for the laity, who composed the Third Order, they too became a lower order of clergy by their profession and put themselves under protection of the church. The way the thing worked out was this. After the Third Order became fairly established, perhaps on some hint from a high quarter, its members refused feudal oaths of allegiance and feudal military service, both of which anyone may see are forbidden by the terms of the rule. The members pleaded benefit of clergy, the exemption of clergy from civil duties and civil punishment, which had been law from the time of Constantine. They appealed to the church for protection, and they received it, for Cardinal Ugolino had now been promoted to be Gregory IV. There have been cases, it is true, wherein a pope has refused to let his left hand know what his right hand has done as cardinal, but now Gregory proved not ashamed of what Ugolino had done. In a bull addressed to the bishops of Italy, he explicitly condemned the exactions of the feudal lords, comparing them to the oppression of the children of Israel by the pharaohs of Egypt. The members of the Third Order of Francis were truly religious, he decides, and the church must stand by its children. He enjoins the bishops to employ all necessary censures of the church to ensure their privileges to members of this order. They are liable neither to military service nor to oaths, but might perhaps be called lawfully to pay a fair money compensation. Here the third of the regulations already cited got in its... Okay, let's read that again. Here the third of the regulations already cited got in its work. Small payments from a host of people brought great sums into the treasury, and those unable to redeem themselves from service and to feudal lords were helped from the common fund. The princes did not indeed give up the contest without a bitter struggle, but the church stood fast and constantly cast its mantle about the Third Order until the feudal lords finally gave way. Feudalism reeled under this deadly blow, and its decline was rapid. It may be shrewdly suspected that the papacy had an axe of its own to grind in this affair, that it was not as so much concerned about the welfare of the people as promoting its own interests. It struck one blow for the poor, but two blows for itself. The nobles were obstacles that popes were glad to have an excuse for suppressing. While this is doubtless true, the rest was the same to the people as if the papacy had acted with an eye single to their good. The whole of the vast power of the church was given at a critical moment to protection of the oppressed, to the redress of grievances too heavy to be longer borne. Defeated in what he looked upon as the great work of his life, Francis found compensation in that on which he had contended least. A very old saying was thus again proven true. In the morning sow thy seed, and in the evening hold not thy hand. For thou knowest not which will prosper, or that, or whether both will be alike good. Okay, this or that. Let me read that again. In the morning sow thy seed, and in the evening hold not thy hand. For thou knowest not which will prosper, this or that, or whether both will be alike good. I believe that is the end of chapter 4. And if it is, we will end here. Let me see. Yep, that is the end of chapter 4. So we'll end here, and then we'll see you back in part 5 for chapter 5. Thanks for listening.